Hi, everybody. My name is Kim Lansdowne. We are here for NAGC 2020 doing a presentation titled Using Local Norms to Improve Racial and Ethnic Representation Rates.
My name is Matangi Salvamainen, and I'm a research scientist at Multi Health Systems. We're a company that develops neuropsychological assessments, and we are working with these lovely authors on a new test.
Hi, I'm Dina Brulles. I am the Director of Gifted Education for Paradise Valley Unified School District in Phoenix, Arizona. And I'm also a Gifted Coordinator Program Coordinator at Arizona State University for the Gifted Masters Program.
Hi, as I already said, my name is Kim Lansdowne. I am the Executive Director of the Herberger Young Scholars Academy, an early entry school at Arizona State University. I'm also on the faculty of ASU Mary Lou Fulton Teachers College. As a matter of fact, right now, today, I am beginning a graduate level course on testing and measurement.
Hi, everybody. I'm Jack Naglieri. I'm a research professor at the University of Virginia and also a senior research scientist at the DeVos Center for Resilient Children, and the author of a number of tests that have been used in a variety of settings, including the gifted. So I'll start by explaining how it is that the four of us are here today. I actually started my work with a focus on understanding how we should measure diverse populations in my first academic job in the early 1980s at Northern Arizona University. And when I was there was a lot of discussion about how to evaluate ability for Native American students and Navajos in particular. And I went to a session one day and listened to a geneticist talk about this population of people, and quite frankly, I didn't like what he was saying. Basically, he was saying that if you live out in the desert, you have to have really good spatial skills. So that means high scores on the nonverbal side of a WISC. And because you don't use language that much, you get low scores on the verbal side of the WISC. And I thought that wasn't right, because most of the cases that I saw, children who were tested with a test in English who didn't really speak English very well, that really invalidated the measurement. And so the first paper I wrote on this was, does the WISC measure verbal intelligence for non-English speaking children? The answer is no. And then a couple of years after that, I published a nonverbal measure of ability called the Matrix Analogies Test, which ultimately became the Naglieri Nonverbal Ability Test. In 2005, I had a presentation at the same conference, and quite by accident, and maybe as fate would have it, isn't a better way to put it, had the extraordinary opportunity to meet Kim and Dina at that conference. And I was so impressed by the depth and the breadth of their knowledge in this field. And the more we exchanged ideas, the more it became clear that we should do something together. So a couple of years later, we published the Helping All Gifted Students Learn book, which was really a teacher's guide for, that was related to the NNAT 2, the second edition at the time. Then more recently, Dina and Kim and I have been developing tests of general ability, a verbal and nonverbal and a quantitative. And that's where we started to have the great, the wonderful opportunity to work with Matangi and many other people at this extraordinary company called Multi Health Systems. And what I was so impressed about when I first spoke to the publisher about this idea was what they liked the most was the meaning of the tests. The meaning being our goal, Kim, Dina, and I, our goal has been for a long time to try to help identify more Black, Hispanic, Native Americans and those with limited English skills to get into gifted programming.
I'd like to add to this that it is just so surprising that it was 15 years ago, right?
Yeah.
And the other thing too is what we talked about 15 years ago, this representation issue there's been very little change in the last 15 years. And so, yes, we are really passionate about this. And yes, we've been working on it for a long time. And we really think that now's the time to change.
So let's just clarify a few terms. When we talk about gifted students, we make a distinction between gifted and talented. The gifted student is a really smart student, talented, very accomplished. You could have a really smart student who doesn't have a lot of knowledge. That's certainly possible. And of course, as we know, that typically students, gifted and talented students, are identified using traditional IQ tests, which have verbal questions and quantitative, mainly word problems. It demands a lot of English. And lots of times, even the very directions that are used involve many verbal concepts and comprehension of the information. So basically, what we're saying is that you have to be mindful of the content of the test, of any test you might use, and how that might be an obstacle to certain children. So the real question is, does a verbal test that demands English really make any sense? Let's look and see. So really, as I just briefly said, we're focusing in on gifted students, whether or not they're accomplished. And the interesting question is, how many students are there in our country today who could have been identified and haven't been? So I recently decided that it was important to try to quantify the number of people out there. So I went to the census, got the US population statistics, how many are in gifted, potentially how many could be in gifted using a 92nd percentile, and just did the math. And if you look at the total number of Black, Hispanic, Native American, and those two or more races, the number is 848,402 people in K through 12 right now who should have been identified as gifted and weren't. And I have the numbers for ELL, and because the ELL overlaps with the number of students in the top part of this, I just put it as a separate. But we could just say easily, roughly 850,000 people. Now, the interesting question is, could this be related to the content of the tests? It's an important question to ask, and we can answer it. First of all, if you look at this survey on gifted ed, what we find is that tests that involve knowledge are widely used. That means the COGAT, the WISC, the Woodcock-Johnson, the Otis-Lennon, Stanford-Binet. All these tests are used, and all of them demand knowledge. Knowledge of English, knowledge of math, understanding, and even expression, verbal expression. In the next slide, what I've provided here is all the information that we have about various ability tests. And if you want to read the details, you can see all the details are cited at the bottom here, and they're all from my book that I published with Tulio Otero a couple of years ago. The Stanford-Binet yields a difference between Blacks and whites of nearly 13 points. The WISC, about 11 points. The Woodcock, about 11 points. Now I put question marks for the Colgate and the OLSAT because the authors never have told us what kind of differences those tests yield. And I think that's a mistake. I think as test authors, I think we have a responsibility to share that kind of information with everyone so people can make good decisions about what to use and what not to use. Now, the green section here, I've summarized the KABC, Cognitive Assessment System. Those are individually administered ability tests that are much reduced in their language. So in other words, they don't have vocabulary or arithmetic subtests and those kinds of things. And then I put in my Naglieri Nonverbal, and I also included the 3 new tests that we're going to talk about. And so the point here being, when you look at the differences between race groups for tests that demand knowledge and those that have a very minimal demand on knowledge, you can see the difference plummets to 50% of what it was. That's the main point of that slide. Now, why is this important? Some people say that there's been sufficient examination of traditional IQ tests to be able to say that the tests are not biased. The people who say that often ignore this information from the standards for educational psychological tests. And the standards make it very, very clear that if a person has not had the opportunity to learn the information that's included in a test of intelligence, that test can be considered unfair because it will penalize or underestimate that person's ability. So equitable assessment can really only be achieved if we use tests that are not confounded by knowledge. And the standards make it really, really clear. Even if a test does not demonstrate what we call psychometric test bias, it still can be considered unfair. So when you hear someone say the tests are okay because they're not biased, you have to also ask, what about mean score differences? So how do we deal with this issue? We have to consider ways of addressing disproportionality. A lot of it depends on select the tests that are less dependent on knowledge. We can use nonverbal tests. We have to think about weighting of a matrix if we're using a matrix. And of course, we've seen a lot of efforts in the last several years focusing in on using local norms as a way of also helping.
All right, so far we've talked about the content of the test and the test itself, but the way that you interpret the results of the test or measure can also impact representation. So specifically, the use of local norms has been shown to improve identification of underrepresented populations. Now, when you use national norms to interpret a student's scores, what you're doing is comparing that student's performance to peers from the same age or grade from across the United States. However, if your school or district student population does not resemble the makeup of the national population, then this might not be the best way to interpret the scores. So local norms, in contrast, allow you to compare a student's performance to grade level peers in the same district or school. And there's even within group norms, which allow you to go kind of one step down and compare a student's performance to peers within even more specific groups, such as Hispanic students or English language learners. So if the goal is to interpret the data to make identification decisions about a particular group of students, whether that's in a school building or a district, then local norms, what it really allows is you to compare those students who you need to make decisions about relative to each other. So a lot of research has already shown that when you do this, it helps in finding more proportional number of high potential students from all racial, cultural, and income groups. So it may seem daunting to change from using national norms to local norms. However, the process is not all that different. You need to consider how many data points you want to use and which ones you want to use. You would then have to collect and organize all of the data. So there is no, when it comes to sample size, there's no real rule of thumb for determining sample size, except that local norms works best if you do universal testing within a particular grade level, say. So, which makes sense. If you're making decisions about your third grade students, then ideally you want to test everyone within that grade level. There's also the consideration of how you want to then combine your multiple data points if you are using more than one measure. So people, this depends on your decision-making model, whether you're using an AND rule or mean rule or an OR rule. And then you'd also need to consider whether you want to apply different weights to certain measures like Jack mentioned earlier. Finally, you've got to decide on your identification criteria. So is this based on a specific cutoff score, or are you considering the number of seats available in your program to make those identification decisions?
So I just want to be clear about something. Whether you use the mean and or rules, I think it bears just clarifying. So if you have, say you have 5 indicators that you're looking at to decide if students should be in. If you calculate the average of the 5, that's the mean one. If you say they have to have 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 5, that would be the AND rule. Or you could have and some OR rules, this or that. Different combinations. All those decisions are going to have a huge impact on what you ultimately get as your pool for students. So it needs to be really carefully examined.
I'd also like to point out here that if you want more information and background on using local norms, this research comes out, this information is developed by Scott Peters, a professor out of University of Wisconsin in Whitewater, and he's done extensive research in this area. So you might want to look up some of his work if you want some more information on how to calculate and use local norms.
Yep. And as you might have noticed, everything that we've described so far applies to both national norms and local norms. Where it starts to actually differ is in how you report and interpret the scores once you have them. So there's different ways to do this. A very straightforward method is rank ordering the scores. So you can rank order them from the highest score to the lowest score. There are Excel functions that will do this for you, and there's tons of spreadsheets and resources out there that will also help you do this. And we'd love to stay in contact with you if you want some assistance with that. Another way is by using local percentile ranks. So in this case, you're potentially taking a raw score and then converting it to a locally defined standard score based on your local group's mean and standard deviation, and then getting a local percentile rank. And then finally, we've also seen some people use local stay-nines, which are similar to the traditional stay-nine in that they range from 1 to 9, and they're based on the scores of the national sample, but then in this case, it would be based on the scores of the students within your local group instead of that national sample. So
what we see schools using most frequently with the local stay-nine is when they combine it with another measure. And unfortunately, a lot of times that is academic or achievement. So you have to be careful when you're looking at local stay-nines and how you're using those so you don't confound the purpose of the test.
Exactly. And the common theme here is that you're using the scores of the students within your local group instead of the national sample to create these different type of local norm scores. They might, apply differently in different contexts. So I'd like to point out, it's important to keep in mind your local group size, because if you have a very small group size, then it might make more sense to use a simple local rank order method, because if you start using or calculating local percentile ranks, then the mean and SD of your very small group can be very skewed and lead you to misinterpret the results. So although there's all these different methods out there, I would caution to really do some research about what makes most sense for your particular context. And that's I want to say the beauty of local norms, in that it allows that flexibility, and the importance there is to figure out a way to use it that makes sense for your particular situation, whether that's your school or your district, and whatnot.
So when we talk about using local norms, we also have to be very careful about the logistics of it all, because when we're looking at identifying students for a program or for a service at a certain district or school based on those local norms from that school or district, we also have to remember that students move. There's a lot of transition between schools. So you have to be careful of how you frame that language as far as the identification. And maybe some schools, like if you're identified and it's using local norms in one school and the child moves to another school, then that criteria has changed. So it's just a caution, just something to consider when you are using local norms and how you frame that message to the community, to parents, to teachers. The other issue here is when we identify, and this is another concept that Scott Peters talks about a lot, is identification for what. We have to program to fit the student's needs. By this, we mean that when we're identifying students using local norms, it's specific to a particular program or service that you're going to be using. So you want to make sure that whatever criteria you're using is you're going to have something to offer that child in order to the benefit that for the best situation or educational instructional aspect what is for that child. So in other words, if one school district has this cutoff and another has that, what difference are you using for what is the instruction going to look like for that? So once again, it goes back to the framing of the message as far as what are you identifying for? So if you have different levels of programs or a continuum of services, which many school districts do, are there going to be different cutoffs for different programs and different services? These are just questions to consider when you are using local norms, because in the past, when we're using national norms, we're missing a lot of students. But if we can use local norms for specific programs or services, we're able to broaden that and help develop that potential that those students might have. But if they go to a different district and a different program criteria, then we have to re-examine that. Just something to consider when you're starting to transition from national to local norms.
And then, of course, the other thing that's always important to consider is what kind of ability concept are we looking to measure? Because that's also going to play into the decisions of whether or not a student seems like they have the potential. Which brings us to the next topic, which is general ability.
So when we talk about general ability crosses from all areas. A lot of times when we were as gifted coordinators or testing in teachers in schools, we're looking at verbal, quantitative, nonverbal. Well, we like to posit that it's all pertains to general ability. It's the construct of the test item that calls it verbal, quantitative, or nonverbal, but it all measures general ability. And general ability is really what allows students to solve problems, to how they manipulate, how they understand information, how they make connections, draw inferences, and analyze simple and complex ideas. So it's the way that they perceive information, and it really boils down to general ability. If you look at an IQ score, for example, you're not going to see verbal, quantitative, or nonverbal per se. You're going to say that this child has a high ability, and that what are we going to do to help promote that that potential that child has. So I like to just say, not really focus as much on the area in which the child has identified as gifted, but to say this child has high general ability that will pertain to everything that they learn in school. So we have to just look at this child as this is a smart child. It has a lot of potential. And I don't want to close off any opportunities by saying you're gifted in math or you're gifted in science, but rather that you have a high general ability that pertains to everything that we're going to be teaching you in school.
If you go back and look at the origin of the concept, it's really an old concept. It's been around for a long time. And I love this quote from Pittner. I actually was in the same office that Pittner had at Ohio State University, only I was there 80 years later. But his definition, we did not start with a clear definition of general intelligence, but borrowed from everyday life a vague term implying all-around ability, and was still attempting to define it more sharply and endowed with a stricter connotation. And then, of course, David Wexler's definition, very similar, to aggregate a global capacity of the individual to act purposely, think rationally, and deal effectively with his environment. A little sexist there, his or her environment. But this is where the concept began. In the Wexler nonverbal manual, I have a section here. Actually, this is some statements that Alan Kaufman wrote, that my emphasis on measuring general ability non-verbally, not nonverbal ability, was completely consistent with what Wexler viewed. Because oftentimes people say, well, the Wexler had a verbal and a nonverbal scale, so Wexler must have believed in verbal and nonverbal intelligences. But that's not the case. In fact, Wexler considered both the verbal and the nonverbal good measures of general ability. So to illustrate this a little bit, I'm going to show you 4 different kinds of test questions that all demand general ability. The first being a typical nonverbal progressive matrix. So to answer this question, you have to look at the top row and see that it changes from a white circle to a blue circle. And then as you go down the column, the white circle becomes a white square that's rotated. So if you go down and to the right, the number 1 option becomes the answer. So in order to arrive at the answer, we have to understand the relationships among the parts. So let's look at the next one. This is a verbal example. So which word is different? Girl, dog, chair, fish. So this is really about verbal concept. So you look at these 4 words and you could say, okay, so 3 of them are living things and 1 isn't. The chair is not a living thing. So again, it's understanding the relationship. And here, math. 3 is to 6 is 5 is to, again, you have to understand the relationship of these to get to the answer of 10. Now I'm going to give you one that, unless you have special knowledge, you won't be able to answer. That's the next one. This is really easy if you're a musician. But if you're not, you can't solve it. But the point is this. C7 to F is E7 is to A. It's all about relationships of those parts. So even though these different questions have different content, the thinking that's required is understanding relationships. That's the essence of this concept of general ability. Let me tell you a little bit about now these 3 tests that Dina and Kim and I developed. A general ability test that demands verbal that has verbal content, nonverbal content, and quantitative content. The tests have different content, but they measure general ability. And the way that we've structured these tests is to maximize equitable assessment. And we'll show you the evidence of that in a minute. But Dina will tell you a little bit more about the verbal test.
A lot of this work is based on the work of Alexander Luria, who was a psychologist who did a lot. His work was with language cognition, and what we've done then is we've used conceptual understandings to view relationships between different concepts that are related to verbal concepts, but without the actual use of language. So what this task is, he refers to it as a superfluous fourth, demands that a subject reason and identify which word does not belong conceptually with a group of others. So for example, in this group, a student would look through these pictures and decide how they all relate to each other and what does not relate to each other. And if each child were speaking a different language, they would still conceptually look at these items and make those connections with their own language in their heads without having to be with their intelligence miscalculated by the lack of understanding of a certain language that the test is provided. So we are using an assumption of the child's conceptual understanding of language without actually using the verbal words that will stifle some of that that demonstration of understanding and ability in that area. So here we are seeing an example of how this actually, we are teaching children basically when they're ready to take the test, how to perform, how to take the test, how to answer the questions without even speaking to them with our language. So if everybody in a room, there's 30 kids or 20 kids or 10 kids in a room and everybody speaks a different language, they can follow these animated instructions and see conceptually how to identify which item does not relate to the others without the use of language, even for the directions for how to take the test, which is really exciting because that really trips up a lot of kids when you're administering a test to begin with. If they don't understand the directions that you're using to tell them how to take the test, how would they then understand how to answer those questions if they were laden with language?
I just want to strengthen the statement that what we're doing here is taking out verbal comprehension out of the instructions. That's a really important point, and the animated instructions work great for that.
So the pilot study that we that we used last year, we had a sample of, in the verbal part, had 2,482 students in that sample, and it was based on a lot of the key demographics throughout the country. And it was so exciting because this is what we see in schools. And as a gifted coordinator, in 2 different districts throughout the last 25 years, I know that we struggle with this, and no matter where we are in the country, that we are going to we're going to see a lot of differences. And it's not just in language, but we also see differences in gender and the parent education level, the level of education with the parents, in addition to race and ethnicity. And the really exciting results from this pilot study show that there were no differences between males and females. There were no difference between white, Black, and Hispanic students, and there are no difference between the educational levels of the parents. And these are key obstacles in most of the tests in many of the tests that we have been using over the last, throughout history, actually.
So the nonverbal measure of general ability. So what I did with this nonverbal test is create new kinds of matrices. And my goal was to continue the evolution from matrix analogies test in 1985 to the various Naglieri Nonverbal Ability Tests to this version with in terms of color and content. And the new types of items are really important, especially for trying to keep ahead of people who think that you can just train people to get high scores on these kinds of tests. So we use the same approach in terms of administration. I think we can show you the video for that next. So the child looks at the options, sees the one. I purposely wanted the student to click the incorrect one first so that they learn how to change an answer and advance to the next one. And that's it. Now, again, we in our pilot study that we did, that in fact we are writing up for publication now, about a little more than 3,500 students, matched the US population very nicely. And we did the same kind of analysis and we found the same kind of result. You know, no gender differences, no race and ethnicity differences, and no differences across parental ed levels. So what we're doing here really is replicating. We do a verbal test with a certain concept. Now we do a nonverbal test. And then next, Kim is going to show you the quantitative test. But in every instance, we're getting the same kind of results. And why is that? It's because of the way we've structured the items, but we're still measuring verbal, nonverbal, and as you'll see next, quantitative.
So one of the things that's really hard for me to do over Zoom is to understand our audience. And so I always ask who people are and who we're talking to. So for the next few slides, I'd really like to specifically talk to the people that administer tests. We've all done this. I mean, and we all have fantastic stories to tell, especially with the young kids when it comes to the directions and the length of the directions. So the quantitative portion is really about reasoning and understanding relationships. It's about sequences. So 1 is to 2 is 3 is to what? The items that are on here test the ability to understand relationships and patterns involving numbers. So the instructional videos, the animated video, which I'm going to move to next. I love this. Now think about if you are a person who's in a room right now and there's 30 computer screens and you've got kindergartners. Okay, just like visualize this with me because we all can do this. You've all been in this situation. And having the kids just simply watch this video, we don't really have to explain it to our students at all. It is just a beautiful, beautiful thing. And we've all said this, everybody said this already, but you could have students that do not speak English, and we have all experienced this. In Matangi, you were even one of the norming days that you all had. You had a student that came in and did not speak any English, and do you want to talk about that for a minute?
Yeah, absolutely. I was lucky enough when we started data collection to be on site with some of our initial schools to make sure, you know, everything's going as planned, smooth. And there was a little girl who had came in just a little bit late, so she missed the part where I had given had set them all up with the video, and the directions. Really, all I would say is press the play button, watch the, you know, that's all. But in any case, she missed it. So I asked her, please just take a seat and I'm gonna come right to you and set you up with it. But because she had her login, I guess while I was busy getting everybody else moving forward, by the time I came back, she was already into the test. So I was like, oh, I'm sorry, let's go back, I'll explain it. And she was like, no, no, no. And she was already on the practice items and doing it correctly. So I was like, okay, so you don't need me at all here. And it was beautiful to watch, because as we develop this, multiple iterations, many beta tests, making sure that it looks simple, like a little 15-second video, but a ton of work went into it. And we did, as I said, multiple live sessions to get feedback from the people who are actually going to be using it. And the kids would, be like, I have no idea what's going on. Back to the drawing board, let's fix it. So to actually see it play out exactly as we had envisioned it, it was quite something.
And Dina and I have often talked about our students. I just had a student that was here at school a few weeks ago, and I printed out our test items for the quantitative. I just wanted to see what it would feel like. And so I said to her, you don't have to finish them, just try some. I just want to talk to you about it when you're done. So I went in a few minutes later and I said, you don't have to finish. And she said, oh no, this is so much fun. Can I finish? Like, that. Go ahead. So the pilot study, really, it showed just exactly what Dina and Jack said about the verbal and nonverbal, that there were no differences with gender, race, ethnicity, and parent educational level.
And of course, it's always important to look at reliability. Internal reliability is all about precision of the scores, and we have excellent reliabilities across all three of them. So we made these verbal and quantitative tests that can be solved regardless of the language a student speaks, with nonverbal directions and no verbal expression required. This is really a big deal, because it's not unusual to have a nonverbal test with a whole page of verbal instructions. And that can be really confusing and hard for kids and interfere with equitable assessment. And so what we wanted to do was provide tests that are going to work across so many populations. And the evidence we have already really tells us that that's the case. So then the question becomes, so how should we use the three tests?
The real key kind of point about local norming is to figure out what works for you. There is no, gold standard for what to do. You really need to evaluate what your goals are for identification, what your purpose is, and then understand the context in which you're going to be applying this, to then figure out, okay, what's the methodology I need to use? And as I already mentioned, there's a ton of resources out there. The hard part is not using those resources, it's figuring out what your goal and your context is. And then, making sure you're applying it, and then evaluate the outcome. If you've switched from national norms to local norms, look at your data. That's insanely valuable. Try and understand, okay, how much of a difference have I made in the proportion of students identified in terms of diversity and whatnot. And that'll really, really tell you whether or not it's worth the effort of having switched over from national norms to local norms. And as I said, our team has been working a lot on understanding local norming procedures. So if there is assistance you want from MHS as a school administrator, we are more than happy to help and partner with schools to get you set up with this. We've already worked with a number of schools during data collection in doing this. And by the time we were done, they were surprised at how easy it was. It just appeared very daunting.
Just the one thing to emphasize, obtain scores for all students, not just those who are referred in some way.
Right.
Because the concept of a local norm is trying to establish what's the composition of the population there. Population being like a school or a school district. So that means you really need to measure everyone. And then when you have the three tests, you need to be sure that you use them wisely. And that comes to this court case, the U46 court case. So this was a really important court case in a district with 42% Hispanic, but only 2% of gifted was Hispanic. There was clearly something wrong. And the Hispanic parents sued the school, and the Judge Gettleman, analyzed all the procedures that were used. And basically what the judge determined was that even though the district used my nonverbal test, the way that they required students to have scores on verbal and math blocked their selection. So they used it like basically an and rule. So you have to have a high verbal score and a high math score and high achievement scores. And so that was the obstacle for so many Hispanic children, even though they had really good nonverbal scores on my test, it didn't work. So that's what we need to do. Carefully consider how the data are aggregated. Okay? So just to kind of recap and get us all in the same spot. So gifted identification based on verbal, nonverbal, and quantitative tests. You can use that approach, but the result that you're going to get is going to be a function of which tests you select. And our goal is to find students from low-income families, those students that we have traditionally ignored, those 850,000 students out there who could have been identified and weren't. And what we've been working on, and I think what we've showed you today with a lot of very convincing data, is that in fact, we can do better. We can find these students. We can make a difference in so many children's lives. For more information, you can go to my website. There's many research papers, videos, handouts from presentations. You can also email me from there, and I'm happy to hear from you. And I think we'll just end with this one quote. This is from the Martin Luther King Memorial here in Washington, D.C., and I think this is a good way to end. So here's his statement. Make a career of humanity. Commit yourself to noble struggle for equal rights. You'll make a greater person of yourself, a greater nation of your country, and a finer world to live in. And I would just add, especially in the era that we're in now. So thank you for listening, and we look forward to hearing from you sometime in the future.